It's Xtreme!
Just like World Supercross champ Jeremy McGrath and his new radio control Xtreme cycle from Tyco RC.
Xtreme Cycle!
Burger King calls this the Xtreme double cheeseburger.
I'm going to show how new right guard extreme sport works even under the most extreme conditions.
Yep, smells like extreme spirit. If you were a kid in the late 90s and early 2000s, there were some basic facts that made up the fabric of your reality. The sky was blue, summers were awesome, girls loved boy bands. Pierce Brosnan was the only James Bond. Marilyn Manson was the source of all the world's problems. And everything, and I mean everything, was extreme. For my little brain that was trying to make sense of this world that I was suddenly brought into, these things felt like they would be permanent, eternal truths of life. Alas, one day I grew up and realized that fads that seem to rule the world at one moment can vanish the next. And now I'm sitting here as an apathetic adult trying to make sense of it all. For some reason, all of the things I liked back then had to be wild and dangerous, wacky and gross, or all of the above. And I'm not complaining. I couldn't get enough of the weirdness back then, and you probably couldn't either. But now that I'm old enough to process it all, I want answers. Why the hell was everything back then so freaking extreme? And that was the question that sent me off on a search to fill in the blanks of my childhood. But to my surprise, there are next to no answers out there. This calls for a YouTuber with too much time on his hands. I'm joking, the only time I have on my hands are these wrinkles. Anyways, today we're getting down to the bottom of this. Because after some research, I think I have a pretty good handle on why the extreme ethos temporarily dominated our lives. And dear viewer, in this video I'll tell you why. However, this research led me down an unexpected path. To tell you why the world became extreme, I need to address another pop culture oddity that I'll call the X-obsession. This term refers to how many brands from the 90s onwards use the letter X in their advertising. The rise of the extreme trend and the X-obsession are so closely linked that it's worth talking about both. With all that preamble out of the way, why don't you grab some Pringles and a can of Mountain Dew as I analyzed the 90s extreme trend. In the online discourse around this topic, most people tend to agree that the extreme trend started as a reaction to the 1980s. Firstly, it fell in line with the counterculture spirit of the 90s, which rejected things that felt too safe and corny. Secondly, the 80s had so much pop culture innovation that would be difficult to top. For that reason, brands had to keep upping their game to stand out. This process led to things getting more and more wild as the new decade found itself. Altogether, by the 1990s, entertainment targeted at young people needed to signify that it was both outstanding and defiant to be seen as cool. A famous example of this advertising style was Sega's "Genesis does what Nintendo don't" campaign. With this slogan, Sega enforced the idea that their console was more powerful and rebellious than the Super Nintendo, and they had just the right mascot to lead the charge. This marketing strategy worked brilliantly, making Sega Nintendo's first true rival, and many companies followed suit with their own line of defiant, in-your-face advertising. But this boundary-pushing style needed a nice little word to tie it all together, and by the mid-90s, they had it. For instance, the popular 1980s toy line, G.I. Joe, rebranded to G.I. Joe Xtreme in the 1990s. Which meant that it's G.I. Joe with wild character designs or something. It's extreme, blah. Whatever it was, people were intoxicated by this shiny new word. But products didn't need to carry the extreme tagline to be a part of the movement. For example, a soft drink line called Surge displayed its outrageous spirit with a number of insane commercials and the tagline, "Life's a Scream." This radical advertising approach peaked from the mid-90s to the early 2000s. If you grew up back then, you probably know most of this already and have a general understanding of where this trend came from. So from here on out, I'll dive deeper and give you my theory on how pop culture became extreme. Until now, the research in this area was quite limited, but since I seem to care about this stuff more than most people do, I guess I'll be the first to try and conquer Mount Extreme. And lucky for you, I know Google Foo. Let's start by establishing how extreme gained traction as a trendy buzzword. To find this out, I searched through various databases for the word, starting with results from the 1980s and went from there. The earliest relevant use of the term that I found was the popular 1986 cartoon, Centurion's Power Extreme. This series featured a group of action heroes who could form crazy weapon combinations with their powerful exosuits. This idea made for a great toy line. While the show was the most 80s thing ever, its use of Xtreme, starting with an X, was impressively a decade ahead of its time. By 1990, a band called Xtreme achieved mainstream success with one of the most famous acoustic ballads of all time. But their big hit is the least extreme song I've ever heard. And extreme means more than words. It was a lifestyle, one that this band didn't really represent. But still, having a multi-platinum band of the same name definitely kept the momentum going. 1990 featured another artist who was likely a bigger factor in Xtreme becoming the word of the decade. For a hot moment, Vanilla Ice was the most popular musician in America, and his blockbuster album titled To the Xtreme, along with his live album, world tour, and a massive #1 single, all prominently featured the word. Although it was manufactured, Ice was marketed with a rebellious image that more closely resembled the meaning that Xtreme would come to embody. In time, the Xtreme tagline became synonymous with its shortened X variation, something that Centurion started but wouldn't catch fire until the late 90s. And the first instance of this spelling of Xtreme in the 90s is astonishing. I'm sure you're thinking it was some up-and-coming band or a video game or a sport. Well, everybody's gonna leave their seat cause it was Kiss. In 1992, Kiss released a videotape filled with concert footage and behind-the-scenes interviews called Kiss Xtreme Close-Up. So do we really have Gene Simmons to thank for the Xtreme trend? No way, Jose. It's likely just a fun coincidence. In 1993, I found the first major use of Xtreme that totally embodied the 90s meaning of the word. So from here on out, I'll list the 4 main factors that made the Xtreme trend explode. I believe a main factor that helped kick off the Xtreme trend was X-Men and X-Force. On October 1st, 1993, X-Force Annual No. 2 introduced the world to Adam Xtreme. Adam X was a mysterious, knife-wielding assassin who was also the lead singer of a grunge band called Palace and Blades. I'm just having fun, but in this case, the character's biography really isn't that relevant. What's truly important is what he represented. This issue of X-Force finally used Xtreme in its purely 90s context, invoking an image that was dangerous, edgy, and in line with the modern counterculture spirit. An X-Force comic being at the forefront of this trend basically confirms something that I already suspected. I believe that the success of the X-Men was a major factor of both the Xtreme trend and the X-obsession gaining traction. Even though I was just a child in the 90s, something that will forever be burned in my mind is just how big of a deal the X-Men were. Their merchandise was everywhere, Wolverine was everyone's favorite superhero, the cartoon was massive, and X-Men #1 is still the best-selling comic book of all time. The X-Men were the embodiment of the Xtreme ideal. They were outcasts with a number of anti-hero members, which was all the rage at the time. Their varied mutant powers gave artists like Rob Liefeld unlimited potential to work with, and helped found the style that comic book fans sometimes refer to as 90s Xtreme. This style is signified by ridiculously busy character designs, with big muscles, bigger guns, bionic body parts, and one pouch for every bullet. When you consider the massive popularity of X-Men combined with Generation X dominating youth culture, it makes sense why the letter became so popular. And Adam X is a good representation of how the Xtreme ethos naturally blended with the X-obsession. But just like the X-Men themselves, the trend was greater than the sum of its parts. It had a lot of assistance in the form of Xtreme media. While it took a few years for the Xtreme buzzword to gain popularity, a lot of early 90s entertainment still had its spirit. An early example of this spirit is John Connor from Terminator 2. John Connor represented the Xtreme ideal in both his daredevil attitude and his love for everything counterculture. And just a couple of weeks after T2 was released, the Xtreme action movie arrived with Point Break. Point Break starred Keanu Reeves as a young FBI agent who goes undercover to take down a group of bank robbers, who are also righteous surfer dudes. The movie showcased everything about the Xtreme ethos, from action sports like surfing and skydiving to its death-defying stunts, and its bang-on portrayal of 90s alternative culture. The movie was a major hit and influenced the surge of adrenaline junkie action movies like Cliffhanger, Speed, Gone in 60 Seconds, and The Fast and the Furious. This tide of high-energy entertainment carried across tons of 90s media, with video games like Sonic the Hedgehog and kids shows like Power Rangers. This string of success indicated that there was an audience that was hungry for extreme action. But this audience didn't just want to participate from their living room, they also wanted to create their own adventures, which was a need that was satiated by extreme sports and the X Games. An extreme sport is a physical activity that carries a high level of perceived risk and danger. These activities are usually fast-paced and action-packed and can take place on land, in water, or in the air. Although the origin of this term is unclear, these daredevil sports became very popular in the 90s due to one X factor. In 1993, ESPN devised an event that would showcase all of the best action sports athletes in one competition, and they called this competition the Xtreme Games. The first contest took place in the summer of 1995 and was a huge hit. From then on, it became a yearly event that was later split into summer and winter versions. In 1996, it was rebranded as the X Games. The X Games were a staple of sports television and had a major cultural impact. In the words of Tony Hawk, the X Games put our sports on the map. It inspired kids who were looking for something different to do and gave them the opportunity. Due to the mainstream success of the X Games, action sports became a cornerstone of the 90s and early 2000s childhood, and that's why it remains the most iconic image of the trend. At the time, attaching something to extreme sports was the ultimate signifier that that thing was cool. Hell, even the new age James Bond had to be an extreme sports superstar. The X Games were a crucial part of the extreme trend taking flight, but nothing gains traction without cold hard cash to back it up. And those greedy corporations finally saw the money with extreme marketing. When the extreme trend started catching fire, some forward-thinking companies used it in their marketing strategy. An early example of this approach was Taco Bell's Extreme Nachos campaign. This campaign's commercial featured a number of teenagers enjoying a crazy, action-packed summer while enjoying some extreme nachos. So what the hell is an extreme nacho? Who knows? All that mattered is that people liked the commercials and it worked. Consequently, many companies tried to take control of the extreme market. But they were all of them deceived, for another plan was laid. In the offices of Pepsi and the files of Mountain Dew, a marketing guy forged in secret a master catchphrase that would rule all others. Do the do. In the mid-90s, Mountain Dew started their Do the Do campaign. This campaign showcased pulse-pounding advertisements that targeted a young, thrill-seeking audience. Their commercials were exhilarating, with loud and fun visuals that stood apart from anything else. The great publicity generated by these commercials made Mountain Dew the go-to drink for an ever-growing audience of adrenaline junkies. Their strategy worked flawlessly, and other companies took notice. As a result, a generation of high-octane, wild, and weird advertising was born. And with that, I think we have a well-rounded understanding of why the extreme trend caught a huge wave in the 90s. So to summarize what happened, the rise of the extreme trend was multifaceted and came from many areas of the early 90s media landscape. The first significant use of the word extreme in a rebellious, thrill-seeking context likely came from X-Force Annual No. 2. It's plausible that the massive popularity of the X-Men franchise helped start both the extreme trend and the X obsession. At the same time, a number of daredevil action movies like Point Break strengthened the trend's momentum. This momentum continued to build until 1995, when the X Games made extreme sports a mainstream sensation. And once brands like Mountain Dew made ludicrous amounts of money off of their X Games association, it was a wrap. The extreme tagline was now a proven commodity, and every company wanted in on the action. Thus, we entered a time when the word extreme ruled the world. And that, my friends, is how the 90s extreme trend came to be. Now that we have a clearer understanding of why this trend dominated pop culture, I want to take a moment to bask in the wacky world of extreme. Since we now have an idea where this exceptional trend came from, I'd like to take some time to relish in its glory. I won't cover every extreme thing in this video, but for now, here's an overview of many of the things that tied their sales to the movement. The most iconic part of this craze was, of course, extreme sports. If you were a kid back then, action sports ruled your world. Every single product advertised to you seemed to have some extreme sports infusion. And while the X Games was huge, For me, it was something that was mostly in the background. Extreme sports truly dominated my outdoor hangouts with friends. Rollerblading around the streets, going to the skate park, seeing someone jump a set of stairs in their BMX, or getting a Razor scooter for your birthday. Even though I totally sucked at these sports, it didn't matter. Whether you were the chubby kid who could barely do an ollie, or the coolest dude on the rails, these wonderful tools of mayhem were a core piece of our childhoods. And as awesome as extreme sports were, to me they were still the second best thing that came out of that time. The best thing was ECW. The brainchild of Paul Heyman, ECW gave the adult male audience of the mid-90s what they really wanted. An edgy, counterculture product that felt truly underground. ECW is mostly remembered for its hardcore matches, which remain some of the most brutal action ever captured in the squared circle. But it also had lots of awesome wrestlers like Rob Van Dam, and was a proving ground for the best up-and-coming wrestlers in the world. I was sadly too young to experience ECW in real time, but I have so much appreciation for how it revolutionized the wrestling industry. Without ECW, there's no WWF Attitude Era. A hardcore salute to all the talent who put their bodies on the line to make it happen. Beyond the mat, the extreme ethos made its way to nearly every corner of young male-centric entertainment. On TV, a number of cartoons like G.I. Joe and Dinosaurs held the extreme tagline. The most well-remembered of these series is 1997's Extreme Ghostbusters, a show that's so 90s that it almost feels like a spoof. I mean, it opens with an awesome industrial remake of the Ghostbusters theme, and gives us a hip young team of Eddie Resner, LL Cool Dre, Professor Extreme, and Marilyn Stefani. It feels like they took the urban grunge aesthetic of The Crow and watered it down for a younger audience, which actually worked a lot better than you'd think. If you like the Ghostbusters and 90s cheese, it's a fun watch. The extreme trend even made its way to Disney, who took it in a goofier direction. 2000's An Extremely Goofy movie saw a young adult Max who wanted to become a legend at the college X Games. But to his horror, his well-meaning but clueless dad was also back in college to embarrass him. With this B-movie premise, you'd probably expect a cheap and forgettable cash-in. But much like the goofster himself, the movie is incredibly earnest and gives it its all, with a fun and touching story and great scenes of Goofy and Max shredding it up. Another industry that had its hand in the extreme pie was video games. For games, the Xtreme label indicated that it offered an aggressive, action-packed experience, with energetic music and an edgy art style. Some of these Xtreme licenses included NFL, NBA, Mega Man, and lots of low-budget stuff that nobody remembers. But the most notorious game with the tagline was actually never released. Sega's cancelled 1996 game, Sonic X-treme. This game would have been Sonic's first foray into 3D on the Sega Saturn. Given how poorly the jump to 3D went for many series, perhaps it's better that it never saw the light of day. Moving from polygons to paper, the trend also had its time in comic books, like 1995's Extreme Justice. And in 2001, Marvel made the obvious connection and released Extreme X-Men. Things are really coming full circle, aren't they? But the trend wasn't just exclusive to entertainment media. After Mountain Dew's success, every product aimed at young men had to be more X-tacular than the last. Every Christmas season, you'd be ripping apart your Sears catalog, trying to find the obnoxious toy that your parents would regret buying the most. There were toys like
Tyco RC cars with designs that had to be more in your face than the last. Or you can pull it, twist it, flick it, tease it, pinch it. Yeah, that's the spot. It's bopping extreme.
And once you were done bopping your buzzer, you needed some radical snacks to recharge your batteries. So much junk food at that time carried the Extreme label, which usually meant it was more sour or spicy than normal. But really, it was all just the same crap with a different name. And it didn't stop there. For your pits of fire, you had Extreme deodorant. And you couldn't get through a day of school without your Extreme notebook or your Extreme weekly planner. Wait, what? Extreme weekly weekly planner? What the hell are you supposed to plan for with this thing?
I'm gonna wake up, brush my teeth with some sour ooze, drink some surge, then catch some gnarly waves and some righteous babes.
Oh God. I'm sorry guys, the Extreme weekly planner kind of broke my mind for a minute there. Okay, back on topic. The wave even made its way to the world of soccer moms with Extreme Makeover Home Edition. This series starred Ty Pennington and his team of home designers who helped poor and destitute families by tearing down their old home and building them their own Willy Wonka McMansion. And in the shock of the century, it turns out that most struggling families don't really have that Willy Wonka bread. And it seems like the show eventually did more harm than good. But people really didn't think about its downside at the time, which is more than I can say for its predecessor, Xtreme Makeover Face Edition. This show took average Jills and Joes and transformed them into hot Barbies and Kens with a pinch of hard work and a bucket of cosmetic surgery. It was controversial at the time, but would probably fly better today. They could just rebrand it as A Trip to South Korea, and they'd probably have a hit on their hands. But just as Xtreme Makeover saw its unceremonious end, American pop culture was about to get a gritty makeover of its own, one that didn't have time for the wackiness of the previous decade. Which brings us to our concluding question. What happened to the extreme trend? Unlike the end of the Attitude Era as a whole, I think the answer here is pretty straightforward. It was a case of the hot new thing becoming old and lame over time. The changing, darkening landscape of pop culture in the 2000s may have sped up its demise, but generally speaking, larger-than-life trends like extreme often have a short shelf life, which you really can't say for the X obsession, which clearly isn't going anywhere. All things considered, 90s Xtreme had a really good run, but eventually its point streak had to end. When the extreme trend first exploded into the zeitgeist, it had a good balance of a cool and a funny factor. It was daring and exciting, but never took itself that seriously. But by the mid-2000s, every bit of that cool factor had dried up, and it was only a joke. Its punchline status was already apparent in the early 2000s, as exemplified by a 2001 episode of Stargate titled Wormhole Extreme. But the fat lady really started singing when it became a joke to its target demographic of young men. The 2004 stoner comedy classic, Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, gave us a scene that felt like the funeral of extreme culture. In the scene, Harold and Kumar enter a convenience store and are confronted by a group of a-holes dubbed as the Extreme Sports Punks. These fellas were immature menaces to society who dressed like Limp Bizkits and had the collective IQ of a gerbil. By that time, the message was clear. If you participated in that culture, you were a lame, obnoxious tool bag. However, that notion didn't necessarily mark the end of the extreme trend. In fact, it actually had some shelf life as a joke. For instance, one of my favorite shows from the 2000s called MXC, Most Extreme Elimination Challenge, harnessed the ridiculousness of the extreme trend and combined it with footage from a laughably unsafe Japanese game show called Takeshi's Castle. It's still one of the most hilarious shows of all time. Nevertheless, by a certain point, even the joke became stale, and the extreme trend faded into a pop culture fever dream, one that'll likely only be remembered by the people who lived it. And you know what? I say, that's righteous, dude. Because not everything can be a transcendent, timeless masterpiece. The extreme trend represented a time when a cultural movement and corporate greed combined to make something truly fun. And seriously, when's the last time we've had anything that was pure, consequence-free fun? Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to stop thinking about the past before I have another
Existential crisis.